Somewhere above the Norwegian Sea, a Russian aircraft the size of a Boeing 757 is flying low, slow, and dangerously close to Britain's flagship aircraft carrier. It is dropping devices into the water below, one after another. Devices built for one purpose only: finding submarines. And it is doing all of this while completely ignoring every radio call from the ship it is circling. Within minutes, 2 stealth fighters roar off that carrier's deck, not to attack, to answer a question that NATO has been asking with growing urgency all year. How far is Russia willing to push before someone pushes back? Welcome back. Tonight, we're breaking down an incident that most people scrolled past this month without realizing what it actually signals: a direct encounter between Royal Navy F-35 stealth fighters and a Russian long-range patrol bomber, playing out just off the coast of Iceland in the middle of NATO's most important Arctic naval deployment in years. I'm going to walk you through exactly what happened on July 2nd, then explain what a BARF actually is and why it's a far more dangerous aircraft than its age suggests, then get into why this specific carrier in this specific ocean at this specific moment matters so much strategically, then connect this to a Russian Shadow Fleet tanker that British commandos seized weeks earlier in the English Channel, then bring in the blunt warning issued by Britain's own top military officer, and finish with the hypersonic missile threat that this kind of Russian reconnaissance flight is almost certainly designed to feed information into. Let's get into it. According to the UK Ministry of Defence, the incident took place on July the 2nd, 2026, while Britain's carrier strike group was operating in the Norwegian Sea as part of Operation Firecrest, a NATO deployment built around the aircraft carrier HMS Prince of Wales. A Russian Tu-142 BARF maritime patrol aircraft approached the strike group, and according to the ministry's own statement, it did so repeatedly. The aircraft flew at low altitude and passed unnecessarily close to the carrier itself, and separately to the Type 45 destroyer HMS Duncan escorting it. The ministry did not mince words about what it thought of that behavior, calling it unsafe and unprofessional. While it was in the area, the BARF dropped a significant number of Sonobuoys into the water near the strike group. Reporting from the Aviationist puts the figure at tens of them, while the ministry's own account says roughly 10. Sonobuoys are small floating devices that use sonar to detect and track submarines and other vessels beneath the surface. British forces attempted to make contact with the Russian aircraft over international safety frequencies. According to multiple reports, including from the UK's own Ministry of Defence, the Russian crew never responded. That silence is what turned this from a routine shadowing encounter into something the Royal Navy needed to physically answer. 2 F-35B Lightning II stealth fighters launched directly off the deck of HMS Prince of Wales. They intercepted the Tu-142 and stayed on it, escorting the aircraft until it left the area entirely. The interception was carried out by 809 Naval Air Squadron, a unit whose F-35s are flown and maintained by a mixed crew of Royal Navy and Royal Air Force personnel, worth remembering, because this wasn't a niche or improvised response. This is a dedicated standing air defense squadron built specifically to do exactly this job from a moving flight deck in the middle of the ocean. And here's a detail that's easy to miss but genuinely significant. This wasn't the first pass. According to the ministry's account, the strike group was repeatedly approached by this aircraft, meaning the Russian bomber didn't just clip past once and turn for home. It kept coming back, and it kept dropping listening devices while it did. Now let's talk about the aircraft itself, because the Russian bomber undersells what a Tu-142 is actually built to do. The Tu-142 traces its lineage back to the Cold War Tu-95 Bear bomber family, but the BARF variant, specifically, isn't a bomber in the traditional sense at all. It's a long-range maritime patrol and anti-submarine warfare aircraft, the rough Russian equivalent of America's P-8 Poseidon or the older P-3 Orion, and France's Atlantique II. Its entire job is finding, tracking, and if necessary targeting submarines and surface ships across enormous stretches of open ocean. According to the Aviationist, the specific aircraft involved in this incident carried the serial RF-34059 and the name Yuri Malinin painted in Cyrillic on its fuselage, a detail open-source aviation trackers use to help positively identify it. This is not some obscure detail. Individual airframes like this get tracked and cataloged by open-source intelligence communities precisely because Russia's long-range aviation fleet is small enough that every aircraft and every mission matters. And that fleet is shrinking. The Aviationist also reported that a recent Ukrainian strike on Taganrog airfield destroyed at least one Tu-142 Subhunter on the ground, along with a specialized Tu-142MR Bear J variant, an aircraft whose entire purpose is communicating with submerged submarines. That's an important piece of context. Every Tu-142 Russia loses to a strike deep inside its own territory is an airframe it cannot easily replace, because production of these aircraft ended decades ago. which makes the decision to risk one of a dwindling number of these aircraft flying dangerously close to a NATO carrier group all the more notable. On the other side of this encounter, the F-35B fighters that intercepted it weren't just flying past for a photo opportunity either. According to reporting on the incident, UK F-35Bs conducting these air defense sorties can carry the AIM-120 AMRAAM, a radar-guided, beyond-visual-range air-to-air missile internally in their weapons bay, plus the infrared-guided AIM-132 ASRAAM externally. In other words, these were combat-loaded stealth fighters shadowing a combat-relevant Russian reconnaissance aircraft, not a ceremonial escort. It's also worth understanding why the F-35B specifically is the aircraft Britain relies on for this job. Unlike the standard F-35A flown by the US Air Force, the B model is a short takeoff, vertical landing variant, built to operate from exactly the kind of shorter flight deck HMS Prince of Wales has, without the steam or electromagnetic catapults larger American carriers use. That's what makes it possible for Britain to launch a stealth radar-evading fighter straight off a moving ship in the middle of the Norwegian Sea within minutes of a Russian aircraft being detected, rather than relying on a single land base hundreds of miles away. That distinction matters even more given where this was happening. Iceland itself has no standing military of its own, and has relied on NATO allies to patrol and defend its airspace for decades. Having a carrier like HMS Prince of Wales operating directly off its coast, carrying its own dedicated stealth fighters, effectively gives NATO a mobile, self-contained air defense base that doesn't depend on any single country's territory at all, which is exactly why the Royal Navy has called this the first time the alliance has ever run this kind of air policing mission from a European carrier rather than a fixed airfield. Here's where this stops being a single isolated news story and starts being a strategic signal. According to the Royal Navy, this deployment, Operation Firecrest, marks the first time NATO has ever conducted air policing operations from a European aircraft carrier, not from a land base, from a floating flight deck operating under NATO command in the Norwegian Sea off the coast of Iceland, in a region military planners increasingly refer to as the High North. The strike group itself isn't small. Alongside HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Duncan, it includes the F-35B jets, Merlin and Wildcat helicopters, and the replenishment tanker RFA Tidespring, carrying more than 1,500 British personnel altogether. This is Britain putting its single most valuable naval asset directly into Arctic waters that Russia has treated, for decades, as its own strategic backyard, the transit routes its submarines use to reach the open Atlantic, and by extension, to threaten shipping lanes and coastlines far beyond Russia's own borders. That's exactly why a Russian anti-submarine aircraft showing up here, repeatedly, dropping Sonobuoys specifically in the vicinity of that carrier group, is not a coincidence or a random patrol gone slightly off course. A BARF's entire mission profile is built around locating exactly the kind of high-value naval assets NATO was moving through this exact corridor. Whether this particular flight was actively hunting for NATO submarines escorting the carrier, or simply gathering a broader picture of exactly how Britain's strike group operates, moves, and defends itself, either purpose serves the same underlying goal, building the kind of detailed targeting picture that matters enormously if a real crisis ever escalates in this region. It's also worth understanding why this stretch of ocean specifically has carried this kind of weight for decades. The waters between Iceland and the United Kingdom, together with the gap running up past Greenland, have long been treated by naval planners on both sides as one of the most important choke points in the North Atlantic. The corridor, any Russian submarine leaving its northern bases has to cross if it wants to reach open ocean and threaten shipping or coastlines further south. Monitoring that corridor was a core Cold War mission for exactly this type of Soviet Bear aircraft, and it's a core mission for NATO's submarine-hunting aircraft and surface ships today. Deploying Britain's flagship carrier directly into that corridor under NATO command, for the first time ever, was never going to go unanswered. A Russian patrol aircraft showing up to test how that new deployment behaves is arguably the single most predictable response Moscow could have chosen. Before we move on, let's quickly recap where we are, because this story only gets more interesting from here. A Russian sub-hunting bomber probed one of NATO's most important new carrier deployments, got escorted out by stealth fighters launched straight off that carrier's deck, and did so in one of the most historically sensitive naval corridors in the entire North Atlantic. Now let's zoom out, because this wasn't happening in isolation. This kind of friction hasn't been limited to the skies. Weeks before this intercept, British forces carried out an operation of their own against Russian assets, and it's worth walking through in detail because it shows this isn't a one-sided story of Russia probing and Britain merely reacting. On June 14, 2026, Royal Marine Commandos and officers from Britain's National Crime Agency boarded a sanctioned oil tanker called the Smyrtos as it transited the English Channel. According to Bloomberg and USNI News, this was the first UK-led operation of its kind targeting Russia's so-called shadow fleet. The network of aging, obscurely owned and obscurely insured tankers Russia has relied on to keep exporting oil despite sanctions. The 6-hour operation saw commandos descend onto the vessel using ropes from Chinook helicopters under cover of darkness, supported by Merlin and Wildcat helicopters, an RAF P-8A Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft, the frigate HMS Sutherland, and the mine countermeasures ship HMS Ledbury. The operation was conducted in coordination with France. According to the National Crime Agency, 24 Georgian and Indian crew members remained aboard the tanker, which was anchored off the Dorset coast following the seizure. Prime Minister Keir Starmer addressed the operation directly, saying it delivered another blow to Russia and reminded those funding Putin's war in Ukraine that they could not hide. This wasn't an isolated action either. According to reporting from Al Jazeera, this seizure followed authority granted back in March 2026, when Starmer's government first announced that UK armed forces and law enforcement would be permitted to interdict and board sanctioned Shadow Fleet vessels transiting British waters. It also followed a similar joint operation months earlier in which the United States, assisted by the Royal Navy, seized a Russian-linked tanker off Scotland. An operation Al Jazeera reported had created a clear precedent for the boarding actions that followed it. According to the Atlantic Council, as much as 75% of Russia's crude oil exports move through this Shadow Fleet network, and Sky News has separately reported that as many as 800 of these tankers have passed through the English Channel alone, continuing to help fund the war in Ukraine despite years of sanctions. Britain's first Sea Lord, General Sir Gwyn Jenkins, credited the Smyrtos operation's success to what he called the skills, bravery, and professionalism of the personnel involved. Put together, the Smyrtos seizure and this Norwegian Sea intercept are really two sides of the exact same standoff. Britain squeezing the financial lifeline that keeps Russia's war machine funded, while simultaneously watching its most valuable naval asset get probed by exactly the kind of aircraft Russia would need if it ever wanted to target that asset for real. And the Smyrtos wasn't a one-off case either. Just months earlier, in January 2026, the French Navy intercepted a separate sanctioned tanker called the Grinch in the Alboran Sea, a vessel that had departed from Murmansk in northern Russia, according to Reuters. Fox News has separately reported that as many as 800 shadow tankers have passed through the English Channel alone, with vessels including the Rigel, the Hyperion, and the Kusai, tracked by open-source ship tracking services like Vessel Finder while operating under Western sanctions. And it isn't only oil tankers drawing Royal Navy attention in these waters. In a separate incident, the patrol ship HMS Mersey shadowed a Russian vessel called the Akademi Pashin from the North Sea, through the Dover Strait and down the length of the channel toward the North Atlantic. According to the Royal Navy, that vessel is the first ship ever built specifically for the Russian Navy since the end of the Cold War, built to supply the ships of Russia's northern fleet with the fuel they need to keep operating far from home. That tracking effort came shortly after another Royal Navy patrol ship, HMS Portland, had been monitoring 2 separate Russian submarines inside Britain's area of interest. Taken all together, what you're looking at isn't a single tense afternoon over the Norwegian Sea. It's a running, near-constant contest playing out across an entire maritime front, from submarines off Britain's own coastline to tankers threading through the English Channel to a Cold War-era bomber circling Britain's newest aircraft carrier off Iceland. And this is exactly the backdrop against which Britain's most senior military officer chose to speak out. According to the BBC, Chief of the Defence Staff Sir Richard Knighton stated publicly in June 2026 that the risks and threats facing the United Kingdom are now greater than at any point since the Cold War. He went further, calling it, in his own words, the most dangerous period that I have known, a striking statement from a man with 35 years in uniform. According to that same BBC reporting, Sir Richard specifically flagged that Russia is probing Britain's defenses not only through conventional military activity, but through cyber operations, sabotage, and even assassination attempts. He also revealed that Russian strategic aircraft crossed into or near UK airspace as many times in just the first 5 months of 2026 as they did across the entirety of 2025. A pace of incursions, he said, meant Moscow risks, in his words, crossing a line. Separately, he disclosed that NATO forces have been scrambled 700 times in response to Russian activity across Europe in that same period. When the head of an entire nation's armed forces is willing to put a number like 700 scrambles on the record and describe the moment as more dangerous than the Cold War, a single intercept over the Norwegian Sea stops looking like a headline and starts looking like one data point inside a much larger, accelerating pattern. There's also a diplomatic backdrop worth understanding here. This intercept happened in the run-up to a period of intensified NATO coordination, with member states expected to discuss strengthening the alliance's overall deterrence posture, alongside continued military assistance pledges to Ukraine running into the tens of billions of euros through 2026. Whether or not the timing of this specific Russian reconnaissance flight was deliberate A long-range Russian aircraft probing one of NATO's most prominent naval assets at the exact moment the alliance is publicly discussing how to strengthen its deterrence is, at minimum, a very pointed coincidence. Now, here's the part of this story I think matters most, and it's the part almost nobody covering this incident connected properly. Why does it matter so much that a Russian anti-submarine aircraft was specifically hunting for underwater contacts near this carrier group instead of just photographing it from a distance? Because locating and tracking a high-value NATO asset like an aircraft carrier isn't just about intelligence gathering for its own sake. It's the first step in what military planners call a kill chain, the sequence of detect, track, target, and strike. And Russia's most advanced anti-ship weapon in that kill chain is the Zircon hypersonic cruise missile. According to Putin's own public remarks, the missile was slated to begin entering service with the Russian Navy carried aboard both surface ships and submarines, with the ability to strike targets at multiple times the speed of sound. Russian officials have described the missile as maneuverable enough during its flight path to complicate traditional missile defense intercepts, unlike a ballistic missile that follows a far more predictable arc. A weapon built around exactly that kind of speed and unpredictability is far less useful without an accurate real-time targeting picture of exactly where a carrier group is, how fast it's moving, how it's escorted, and how it defends itself. Precisely the kind of picture a Beref's Sonobuoy run in repeated low passes are designed to build. On the defensive side of that same equation, Russia has separately promoted its S-500 Prometheus air defense system as a platform specifically designed to counter both stealth aircraft, like the F-35, and incoming hypersonic threats, with Russian sources claiming an engagement range out to 600 kilometers. It's worth being clear here. As defense analysts covering the S-500 have pointed out, Russia has offered no independent proof that the system can actually track or engage an F-35 reliably, and the claims remain unverified. But the fact that Russia is actively promoting this narrative at the same time its reconnaissance aircraft are probing NATO's newest carrier deployment tells you this is a two-sided contest being fought as much in perception and deterrence messaging as it is in the water and the sky. Put those pieces together and this single intercept over the Norwegian Sea stops looking like an isolated incident and starts looking like a live rehearsal of exactly the kind of confrontation both sides are actively preparing for. Russian reconnaissance assets probing for weaknesses in NATO's most advanced naval deployments, and NATO's most advanced stealth fighters proving in real time that those probes will be met, tracked, and escorted out every single time. So here's where I land on this one. This wasn't a near miss or an accident. A Russian maritime patrol aircraft flew repeated, low, close passes near a NATO carrier group, dropped submarine hunting sensors while doing it, and ignored every attempt to reach it over the radio. Britain didn't escalate, it didn't fire, it didn't threaten. It simply scrambled two combat-loaded F-35s, stood next to the Russian aircraft until it left, and then made sure the entire incident became public record. That, in itself, is a message. It tells Moscow that NATO's newest carrier deployment in the high north is being watched as closely as it's watching everyone else, and that every single approach will be met immediately, calmly, and without exception. Whether this specific Bear F was actively feeding a targeting picture toward a future Zircon strike, or simply mapping out how this carrier group behaves under pressure, the broader trend line is the one worth paying attention to. Russian probing activity along NATO's northern flank is intensifying at the exact moment Western naval deployments and enforcement operations against Russia's shadow fleet are intensifying right alongside it. Neither side appears to be backing off, and when the head of Britain's own armed forces is willing to say publicly on the record that the threat picture hasn't looked this serious in his 35 years of service, that's not rhetoric being thrown around loosely, that's a warning. Think about everything that had to line up for a single afternoon over the Norwegian Sea to matter this much. A Cold War-designed Russian airframe, one of a shrinking handful still in service, flying thousands of miles from home to specifically seek out a British carrier on its first ever NATO air policing deployment. A British response built not on a land base but on a mobile flight deck, launching combat-armed stealth fighters within minutes. A financial squeeze running in parallel through the English Channel, where commandos are physically boarding the tankers that keep Moscow's war funded. And a defense chief, on the record, telling the public this is the most dangerous period he has personally known in 35 years of service. None of those four things happened by accident, and none of them are slowing down. So the honest answer to where this goes next is that nobody outside a small circle of military planners actually knows yet. What we do know is that every single one of these encounters, in the air, on the water, and in the political statements coming out of London, points in the same direction. Whether you think this settles into a new, tense equilibrium in the high north, or eventually tips into something more serious, is genuinely an open question, and it's one worth watching closely over the rest of this year. What do you think? Is this kind of repeated probing just the new normal in the high north? Or is it building towards something bigger? Let me know in the comments. I read every one of them. If breaking down what's actually happening behind these headlines is why you're here, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps keep this channel going. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.